The Colorado River is a huge economic driver. The estimated economic impact was $1.4 trillion. If the Colorado River Basin were a country, it would be the world's seventh largest by economic output.
Hello and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Tobin, Director of the Water Desk at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm excited to be speaking today to Fay Hartman, Conservation Director of the Colorado River Basin Program at American Rivers. We'll be talking to Fay about a new report she co-authored, Rivers as Economic Engines, which examines the economic value of rivers and addresses our nation's crumbling water infrastructure. That study calls for Congress to invest $500 billion over 10 years on water infrastructure and river restoration. Fay joined American Rivers in 2010. Prior to that, she interned with Wisconsin State Representative Corey Mason, and she was the Economic Research Assistant for Clean Wisconsin's water program. I should also note that both the Water Desk and American Rivers have received funding from the Walton Family Foundation, but as a journalistic enterprise, we're editorially independent from our funders and from the University of Colorado. Welcome to the show, Fay. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Mitch. I look forward to talking with you this afternoon.
Well, you're quite welcome. It's great to have you on. For starters, tell us a little bit about American Rivers, what your group does, and its membership.
Yeah, for sure. So American Rivers is a national river conservation organization that believes that a future of clean water and healthy rivers for everyone, everywhere is essential. Our offices are headquartered in Washington, D.C., but we have offices around the country, including my office here in Denver, Colorado. We really believe that American Rivers is the voice, the nation's voice for rivers. We continue to stand up for wild rivers, and that was really the reason for why American Rivers was founded back in the 70s. But over the years, we've built a really deep expertise and have success on a wide range of issues around clean water, dam removal, flood protection, and last but not least, continuing to engage in kind of the initial activity, protecting wild rivers. We have more than 355,000 supporters, and we believe that American Rivers, our members, our supporters, make a difference every day for rivers, for clean water, and for communities nationwide.
Thanks. That's a helpful introduction. So, American Rivers recently released this report, Rivers as Economic Engines. Tell us what prompted you to do this research and issue the report and some of the main findings.
Yeah, great question. So in the wake of the economic downturn following the COVID-19 pandemic, Congress has made and continues to consider additional investments that are going to jumpstart our economy and bring the millions of Americans of unemployed Americans back to work. When we were considering future economic stimulus bills, we recognized that Congress really has an opportunity, a historic opportunity, to make significant investments in our crumbling infrastructure, which has been underinvested in for decades. We describe, as you mentioned earlier in our report, we recommend that Congress invest $500 billion in rivers and clean water over the next 10 years. On top of that, we really encourage Congress to invest an initial $50 billion in this first year to address some of the really significant and urgent water infrastructure needs that are associated with COVID-19, and then also start to implement some of the shovel-ready projects that would improve flood management and restore rivers across the country. And it's really important that Congress make these major investments in water infrastructure and flood management and watershed restoration, not only to get our economy back on track and to create really important jobs, but also to strengthen our communities, to improve public health and safety, and to address a lot of the longstanding injustices that are facing our country, and to improve our overall environment and the rivers that so many of our communities care about. Communities across the country have, by the projects that they have implemented, show that safeguarding clean water and improving river health creates jobs. It boosts the economy. And so a lot of this information has been compiled. And so as a part of our report, we compiled existing data on the many benefits that the many economic and jobs benefits that rivers and clean water provide. And so just to give you a kind of a little taste of some of the information that we found, if we were to invest $82 billion a year in clean water and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure for the next 10 years, that would generate $220 billion per year in economic activity. And that would produce and sustain, over the 10-year period, 1.3 million jobs. That's a lot. And that would have significant benefits to local communities. Also, how healthy rivers are important, not only for clean water, but also because we like to get outside. People love to recreate in and around rivers, and healthy rivers, plow money back into the economy through recreation activities. The Outdoor Industry Association found that water sports and fishing, directly generates $175 billion in retail spending annually, and supports over 1.5 million jobs across the country. The kind of third piece that we talk about is the importance of ecological or watershed restoration. So things like in-stream and riparian restoration work. And that sector directly employs 126,000 workers nationally. So those are the people moving dirt and planting trees. And then on top of that, it supports another 100,000 jobs indirectly. So those jobs that support people that are on the ground. And those two together contribute $25 billion to the economy annually. And that's from the University of North Carolina. And there's a lot more detailed information, both at a higher kind of national level, but then also really specifically diving into how communities, from coast to coasts, from urban to rural communities have benefited from healthy rivers, river restoration, and clean water projects across the country. So I'd really recommend kind of digging into our report to learn a little bit more about either what's happened in your community or the opportunities to revitalize our economy and create jobs while protecting rivers and improving public health and making us all stronger together.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. That's really helpful. It's interesting, we often hear about environmental protection being held up in opposition to economic development and growth and jobs, but in this report you're making the case that protecting rivers, restoring them is actually a job creator and generates and is responsible for a lot of economic value.
Definitely.
So, what are some of the bills that are in Congress right now? How are they proposing to deal with this? We've heard a lot about our infrastructure, not only in the water sector, but elsewhere. What's happening on Capitol Hill right now?
Yeah, great question. So I guess, first off, really exciting news. Last week, both the House and Senate passed the Great American Outdoors Act, which is a huge win for public lands and waters across the country. And this legislation does two main things. First of all, it establishes the National Park and Public Lands Restoration Fund that's going to provide, up to $9 billion over the next 5 years to fix a lot of deferred maintenance that our national parks and wildlife refuges and forests and other public lands have had for a really long time. And that's, again, really important for, not only the health of our public lands and waters, but also, for enjoyment for us to get out and explore these places a little bit more. And it also permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a flagship conservation program that helps to fund our national parks and forests and wildlife refuges. So that's really important, and it also provides the LWCF provides funding and grants to local and state governments to acquire land for recreation and conservation. So again, continuing to provide more opportunities for everyone to get outdoors. And then on top of that, Congress is continues to think about and consider a number of other bills that address water infrastructure improvements and river health. The House of Representatives recently passed their Moving Forward Act, which was H.R. 2, that included $40 billion for wastewater, $25 billion for drinking water. And obviously that is amazing. That is super important. That is very much a part of the recommendations that we outline in our report. And we support and applaud the increase in that funding. And we really urge Congress to continue to do more and think about how we can, commit to that $500 billion 10-year investment that we recommend. And then on top of that, yesterday, the House of Representatives also unanimously passed by voice vote the Water Resources Development Act, which is a bill that authorizes water infrastructure programs and projects across the country, and then sets a lot of the national priorities for the development of waters across America. And in the House bill in particular, it included provisions that create incentives and build capacity for natural infrastructure solutions, which is again, another important and critical recommendation in our report that will help things like flood management and community resilience in the face of a changing climate. The Senate's companion bill to WRDA, the acronym for the Water Resources Development Act, was approved back in April. So those are just some of the things that are moving, and we'll continue to kind of pay attention and ensure that the important recommendations that we make are included.
Thanks. That's a helpful summary. Seems like a lot's going on at a very busy time for
Yes.
Congress and others. We're in the midst of this economic crisis. And if you look back historically at things like the Great Depression, the Great Recession, there were efforts during those crises to try to help the economy and address infrastructure, and specifically water infrastructure. So it seems like there's a historical model or template for this. Tell us a little bit about previous economic downturns and infrastructure and how that has played out.
Yeah, definitely. So, there's a huge connection between past economic downturns, like you said earlier, the Great Depression and the Great Recession, and how infrastructure has helped us to get out of these challenges that we've been facing. So, if we think back to the Great Depression, the Public Works Administration, they built infrastructure. It was massive dams and other water projects like, the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, or Fort Peck on the Missouri, Grand Coulee on the Columbia, and then the locks and dam systems kind of on the upper Mississippi River. And while those were, important projects at that point, our rivers were harnessed and the ecosystems were degraded, and that really devastated, watersheds across the country. And not only that, but it also displaced indigenous people, local communities. It destroyed, cultural sites and inundated really important riverside lands. And so I think, when we think about how we want to put millions of Americans back to work and rely on, infrastructure and the jobs that are generated by, building and improving, our rivers and our water infrastructure systems, we need to look back at our previous stimulus investments and build on their successes, the things that went, really well in the stimulus package after, the Great Recession. There was a lot of opportunity to, implement green infrastructure and other important projects like that. And that was, hugely important, not only for, communities, but also for job creation. So we should build on those successes, but then also learn from drawbacks and challenges, from things like, some of the issues that we had during the Great Depression. And I think it's really important to recognize that we don't have to trade the health of our rivers and, our communities for economic prosperity, and that economic success and our future job growth really, and environmental health really go hand in hand, and that, that needs to be reflected in our future stimulus efforts.
This is Water Words, a fast explanation of a bit of water lingo. I'm Hannalee Myers. Today's water word is gray water. The EPA defines gray water as any wash water that has been used in a home or business except water from toilets. Examples of gray water include water previously used in baths, showers, most sinks, and washing machines. Because gray water contains fewer pathogens than water contaminated by sewage, called black water, gray water can potentially be reused for tasks like flushing toilets and irrigating plants. Water used for bathing, sinks, and washing machines accounts for over 50% of all domestic water use. As a result, many water conservationists and advocates for green infrastructure say that by reusing gray water, we can decrease demand on our natural water systems, lessen strain on water infrastructure, and reduce pollution and energy involved in water purification. So if you hear someone reference gray water and you imagine water that could be reused, but isn't suitable for food preparation or drinking, you're correctly imagining gray water. Now back to the Water Buffs podcast.
So the work that you've been describing is nationwide, but I'd like to focus on the southwestern portion of the country and the Colorado River Basin. Tell us a little bit about how the Colorado River and its tributaries generate jobs and economic value in the region.
Yeah, definitely. So, the Colorado River Basin is hugely important to the economy of this region. The river directly impacts the economies of 7 states, and then it's and 2 countries, both the U.S. and Mexico. So it's really important on a broad, national and global scale too. In 2014, Arizona State University released a study that looked at the economic importance of the Colorado River for both the upper basin and the lower basin, so the entire reach of the river. And they found that the estimated economic impact of water from the river was $1.4 trillion in gross state product, which is a huge number and a very significant amount of money. And then that on top of that, it contributes 16 million jobs and $871 billion in labor income. And if you put it into scale about kind of how that fits into things, more broadly across the world, if the Colorado River Basin were a country, it would be the world's 7th largest just in terms of economic output. So that's a pretty significant illustration of how important the Colorado River is for our regional and our national and the global economy.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we think and drill down a little bit more into Colorado, for example, rivers and water are really also obviously an important part of our economy. CSU, Colorado State University, found that agricultural jobs in Colorado, which are very dependent on our, reliable sources of water, are, anywhere from 93 to 100,000. And then earlier this year, Business for Water Stewardship released a report that found that Colorado's rivers, in terms of recreation, are also a really key driver for economics across the state. Our rivers support over 131,000 recreation and tourism jobs in Colorado alone. And then, the river recreation contributes $18.8 billion in economic output for the state. So that's, again, a really big and important numbers about how much rivers are integral to our economy.
Mm-hmm. Great, that's helpful. So when you think about the issues of infrastructure and needed investment in the Colorado River Basin, what are some of the places that are important to address right now?
Yeah, definitely. So, I think there's a number of different projects and strategies that are needed, that are in need of greater investment. And this includes things like river restoration, river protection, municipal and urban water conservation, agricultural conservation and efficiency, flexible water sharing between cities and ag, and then stream management plans with specific actions that can help to keep our rivers healthy. So again, in Colorado, we're using more water than our rivers supply. We have a booming population, and the snowpack, which is really important to how our rivers move, and the water that flows through them has been really variable. And for the most part, below average across Colorado for the last 2 decades or so. But Colorado has a plan for how we can think about this and how we can address some of these challenges and invest in projects that are going to make us stronger. So the Colorado Water Plan is this plan, and it's the product of many years of work and actually the input of over 30,000 Coloradans to help identify kind of how we can address some of the challenges that we're facing. And this plan identifies projects kind of like what I was talking about earlier, like stream management plans, agricultural improvements, conservation, efficiency. One that I really want to kind of dive into a little bit more is the development of stream management plans across the state. So stream management plans are, a data-driven assessment of river health that help communities prioritize how they can protect or enhance environmental and recreational assets in their community. And these plans are, locally driven, developed by those members of the community that identify ways and projects that can improve the health of local rivers while still maintaining the viability of local economies and reducing risk for those communities into the future. And communities across the state, all four corners are have or are in the process of developing stream management plans and are beginning to fund and implement those projects that they've identified in the plan.
Mm-hmm. So when people talk about infrastructure improvements related to water, people might think of creating new dams, new aqueducts, waterworks. Is that part of all of this and what's needed in the region?
Yeah, so I think specifically related to Colorado and the Colorado Water Plan, the Water Plan doesn't specifically have plans or specifically support any specific storage project. But the plan, does indicate that the state can act as a participant in those types of projects that align with the plan's value. But what's really important is that they have to follow a really specific, 7-step criteria for any new projects, like that. And that's really important when we think about, the development of those types of potential projects. And a lot of the projects that people might think about, and are really focused on improving the efficiencies at existing storage sites, looking at conservation and reuse, and then potential agricultural transfers.
Mm-hmm. So the report talks a lot about the inequities in the water system and environmental justice issues. Tell us a little bit about that and what the problem and what the nature of the challenge is.
Totally. Yeah. So, I think, there are roughly 2 million people in our country that lack access to clean water, indoor plumbing and wastewater treatment. And the Food and Water Watch did a study in 2016 that showed that 15 million people had their water shut off for non-payment. And in many cities, water and sewer access, weren't made available to Black and brown communities, another kind of sort of redlining. This is evident, for example, in historical maps that were drawn for the city of Atlanta, Georgia. And moreover, in many both rural and urban areas, water quality is also a really serious concern. And too often, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other historically marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted with limited access to clean, safe, and affordable water.
Mm-hmm. And are there any specific places here in the Colorado River Basin that are kind of hotspots for that?
In terms of injustices?
Injustices and inequities.
Yeah. So, I think one example that has been talked a lot about are some of the challenges facing the Navajo Nation and the issues around access to clean water there. So that's a really important example of how we need to address these challenges and improve and make sure that everyone has access to clean running water and/or plumbing and wastewater, because it is essential and a right that we all have.
Mm-hmm. So the issue of water affordability has come up, especially now during this economic crisis when so many people are hurting and without jobs. Tell us a little bit about the lay of the land in terms of water affordability in this country and It seems like it's an even bigger issue today now.
Yeah, it definitely is. Like I said earlier, across the U.S., millions of Americans, lack access to one of the most basic necessities of life. And this is about communities being able to afford and being willing to prioritize clean water and sanitation for all of their community members. And as a country, we need to support and provide funding to communities that can't otherwise afford to build out their water infrastructure systems. Many people that don't have access to clean water have had their water shut off because of unaffordable water bills. There's a couple of studies that estimate that by 2022, a third of Americans will not be able to afford their monthly water bill, and that's mostly due to rate increases with trying to repair, a lot of the aging water infrastructure that's plaguing cities across the country. And water affordability is often left up to local communities and utilities, where subsidizing rates at the local level can be a really significant financial burden for a lot of these small municipalities. And to address the challenges that are facing our water infrastructure, it's really important that federal funding, prioritizes the restoration and maintenance of water infrastructure system, and that federal and state funding is really the only way to ensure that all local communities have access to clean, affordable water and protection from sewage overflows and flooding.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned sewage overflows, and we talk a lot about drought and water scarcity here in the American West, but your report also talks about the issue of flood management, which is also an issue here in the region. So tell us a little bit about the priorities in terms of flood management.
Yeah. So, flooding is a significant issue for communities across the country. Over 40 million people across the United States live in floodplains. And the traditional flood control measures like dams or levees or concrete flood channels, tend to give people an unwarranted sense of security, as these measures don't prevent all flood damages. And in fact, these types of infrastructure projects can really make flooding worse, passing a lot of those issues downstream, and disrupting natural river processes and perpetuating this cycle of damage, repair that have devastated communities, have significant costs to life, to property, to taxpayers, and to the environment. And when in the report, when we consider how we can make our communities stronger and more resilient, it's essential that we modernize our flood management approach. So investments should incentivize a shift from this outdated flood management and control approach that we have to an integrated flood management approach that prioritizes equitable, multiple benefit solutions that ensure all communities are resilient to flooding. And this includes things like incentivizing and building capacity for natural infrastructure solutions, like I mentioned earlier, and ensuring that flood hazard mitigation plans consider climate change and include climate resiliency planning and integrate, again, natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions.
Mm-hmm. And another part of the strategy that you talk about in the report has to do with habitat restoration, improving areas that have been damaged or in trouble. Tell us what that actually involves in terms of actually doing those types of projects, and specifically here in the Colorado River Basin.
Yeah, for sure. So investment in healthy ecosystems and restoring these places creates so many economic benefits, not only because of the creation of new jobs and, the moving of dirt, like we talked about earlier, but also through ecotourism, outdoor recreation, increased resiliency for local communities. And restoring rivers, improving agricultural practices have a ton of benefits for local communities and for their economies. By restoring these watersheds, rivers become healthier, they're cleaner, they're more resilient, and agriculture benefits from a healthier river too. Improved stream flows, better soil health, and aquifer recharge, all things that are really important there. And when we dig down to some projects that are happening here in the Colorado River Basin that are benefiting communities, river habitat, water quality and quantity, and ag, there's so many great examples. And two that we highlight in our report, talk about both the economic benefits and then also obviously the quality of life and the environmental benefits that are associated with it too. So on the upper Colorado River in Grand County, a coalition of ranchers and other partners are working to restore 12 miles of the upper Colorado River by creating structures that improve both irrigation, agricultural irrigation systems, and also improve riparian and aquatic habitat. And these types of solutions are great because they work with the river system. They are sustainable, they're cost effective, and they reduce long-term operations and maintenance. This project in particular cost about a little over $3 million, $3.4 million, and has stimulated 18 local jobs in the area of crumbling in Grand County, Colorado, while also, like I said earlier, improving irrigation, improving soil and water quality, and aquatic habitat downstream. And this solution is great because it's a win for the river, it's a win for recreation, and it's a win for the local ranching community. I think another important thing to note is this project received funding from the federal government and the state. And so I think it shows how when you have projects that have multiple benefits and are kind of good for everyone, you can really find the funding that's needed to make those projects happen. And if we were to move downstream to Arizona, a grassroots initiative in the city of Yuma, Arizona, brought together kind of similarly a number of stakeholders to restore some pretty degraded habitat along the lower Colorado River. And since the project started, over 350 acres of wetlands and riparian areas have been restored. And the area was actually designated as the Yuma Crossing Natural Heritage Area. And similarly, funding for this project came from a number of sources, from the federal government, from the state government, from the city, and then also from tribal funding. And this project employed over 150 people in full-time and part-time jobs, and it's had huge economic growth for the community. It restored over 300 species of wildlife, great opportunities to get outside and recreate and enjoy. There's trails and access points and overlooks, and the community estimates that over 200 people a day visit and enjoy Yuma Crossing in the summer, which is a really great example of how and why places like this are so important.
Great, thank you. So we really don't know where things are going in 2020 on a lot of fronts, but just wondering, what are some of the other issues that you and American Rivers are working on related to the Colorado River and its tributaries?
Yeah, definitely. So, I think like a lot of folks, we're working on a lot of different things. We're working on reducing risk across the entire basin. We're thinking about how we can, establish conservation funding for river restoration, recreation, protection, for agricultural improvements. We're thinking about ways that we can protect, the last best rivers in the Colorado River, like the Gila River in New Mexico. We're working to restore really important headwater streams. We're thinking not just about above ground, but we're also thinking below ground. How can we elevate the issue of groundwater and over depletion, in places like Western Arizona? And then, we're also thinking about strategies to reduce demand, including demand management and system conservation. And, I think all of this work is so important, but one really key part of this work, and I feel like you will appreciate this, is elevating communications, talking about it, educating, communities and constituents across the Colorado River Basin about, the importance of the Colorado River as tributaries of water, and helping people to understand really complex issues, and how and why water in the Colorado River is so important to them and to the lives that they live and love.
Great. Well, this has been really interesting. I'm glad that you're able to join us. Is there anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, I think I would just encourage people to check out our report and the website. We have a ton more detailed information about the importance of investing in healthy rivers and clean water. You can read it on our website, and you can take action to urge Congress to invest in healthy rivers and clean water at americanrivers.org/invest in rivers. In addition to that, we have some really great communications assets. We've got some awesome posters and other infographics that help to describe and illustrate the importance of rivers and clean water for all of us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Fay, for joining us. Really found this very interesting and look forward to seeing the work that you do ahead.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks so much, Mitch, for having me. And it was great to chat with you.
Thanks. Thanks for tuning in to the Water Buffs podcast, available in audio and video formats on most major media platforms. Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. You can learn more about us and about water issues at waterdesk.org. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you have a comment or have a question, please feel free to email us at waterdesk@colorado.edu. Special thanks to the executive producer and co-manager, Hannah Lee Myers, and to our graphic designer and co-developer, Jeff McGee. Be sure to check out our other episodes, and until next time, thanks for tuning in.